Today, we revisit a series of events that scarred Australia's national memory, the Sydney gang rapes. I'm your host, Rob Reimer, and this is Australia's Crime Files. These crimes shook communities to their core, sparked political and cultural firestorms, and forced major legal reforms. More than 2 decades later, their impact still lingers in our courts, our media, and our conversations about justice. Between years 2000 and 2003, Sydney, often thought of as a safe, multicultural city, was rocked by a string of orchestrated gang rapes. The crimes had shaken Sydney, but for detectives, the question was clear: who were these men? It began with the survivors. Brave young women, many still teenagers, stepped forward. In heartbreaking detail, they described the assaults. They remembered the men's faces, their accents, the words hurled at them. Patterns started to emerge. These weren't isolated incidents. Each attack involved multiple offenders, cars waiting nearby, victims picked up around train stations or bus stops, and secluded parks where the assaults took place. The similarities told investigators this was organized, this was deliberate. Then came the breakthrough. The attackers hadn't just coordinated in person, they'd used their mobile phones. Detectives secured warrants and examined call logs and SMS records. What they found was damning. Text messages that talked about hunting women, messages laced with racist taunts and sexual bravado, digital fingerprints tying the men together in a conspiracy of violence. Surveillance confirmed what the victims described. Cars linked to suspects matched those reported in the assaults. Detectives quietly tracked the vehicles, gathering evidence. And then the science spoke. Forensic testing on biological samples provided matches. DNA linked the Scaff brothers and their accomplices directly to victims. It was the piece of evidence the defense couldn't argue away. But the community played a role too. After headlines exploded, members of Sydney's Lebanese Australian community passed on tips, some reluctantly, fearing the backlash, but enough to strengthen the case. By late 2000, police had the evidence they needed. Coordinated raids followed. Young men who believed they were untouchable were pulled from their homes, placed in handcuffs, and taken into custody. Interrogations were tense. Some denied everything, others contradicted themselves under questioning. Piece by piece, the investigation closed in until the net was inescapable. And when it came time for trial, multiple victims identified their attackers in court. Despite defense challenges, their stories lined up. Combined with DNA and digital evidence, the picture was undeniable. The Sydney gang rapists had been unmasked. The ringleader was 18-year-old Bilal Scaff. His younger brother Mohammed also played a major role. They weren't alone. Other names: Bilal Hajay, Mohammed Sanusi, Mohammed Chami, Tayyab Sheikh, and Mohammed Ghanem, became synonymous with the horror of those years. By the end, 9 men would be convicted, serving over 240 years combined. But beyond the numbers was the sheer cruelty. Victims reported the attackers used racial slurs during the assaults. They were weapons designed to humiliate, to degrade, to remind the victims that this wasn't just sexual violence, but also a statement of power. And chillingly, these weren't spontaneous crimes. They were coordinated through text messages, an early sinister example of how mobile technology could be used to plan group violence. The crimes didn't just horrify, they polarized. Conservative commentators painted them as proof of cultural incompatibility, linking them to terrorism and immigration policy. Miranda Devine described the rapes as hate crimes, not only against women, but against Australians more broadly. On the other side, some argued that the racial and religious framing risked inflaming prejudice against Muslim and Middle Eastern communities. They urged that these should be seen as crimes of misogyny, not ethnicity. Either way, the media storm was relentless. Newspaper headlines screamed. Talkback radio boiled with anger. And many Australians began asking difficult questions about immigration, integration, and justice. The trials themselves were grueling. Victims endured harrowing cross-examinations, forced to relive their trauma in public courtrooms. Judge Michael Finnan QC compared the crimes to wartime atrocities. One problem quickly became clear. The law didn't clearly define consent. At the time, Newswester's Crimes Act lacked a precise explanation, leaving jurors confused and lawyers exploiting gray areas. Initial sentences were tough. Bilal Skaff received 55 years, his brother Mohammed, 32 years. But then came appeals. The Court of Criminal Appeal ruled the punishments were manifestly excessive. Sentences were slashed. For victims, it was a gut punch. For the public, it looked like the system was failing. Politicians promised reform. Just when people thought justice was served, the case took another shocking turn. Two jurors decided to visit Gosling Park, one of the crime scenes, on their own. They wanted to check the lighting conditions. That breach of process forced convictions to be quashed. Retrials followed. For victims, that meant testifying again, reliving everything, again. This episode highlighted how fragile trials are, and how misconduct, even by well-meaning jurors, can derail justice. Legal reforms sparked by the cases. The fallout led to sweeping legal changes in U.S. West. Aggravated Sexual Assault and Company Act 2001 created a new crime category with a maximum penalty of life in prison. Ban on self-representation in sexual assault trials. Accused could no longer personally cross-examine victims. Jury Amendment Act 2004, harsh penalties for jurors conducting outside investigations. These weren't just tweaks. They reshaped how Australia handles sexual assault in the courtroom. Community and cultural reactions. The anger didn't fade quickly, and at times, the community response deepened divisions. In 2006, Sheikh Taj el-Din al-Hilali delivered his infamous uncovered meat sermon during Ramadan. He suggested women who dressed immodestly were like meat left out, destined to attract cats. His comments were widely seen as alluding to the Skaff rapes. The backlash was swift. Muslim women's groups condemned him. The wider community was furious. The sermon, instead of healing divides, reinforced the cultural and gender tensions that the rapes had already exposed. Release of Mohammed Skaff. Fast forward more than 2 decades, and the case once again dominated headlines. On October 6, 2021, Mohammed Skaff, once a 17-year-old participant in the gang rapes, walked out of prison after serving 21 years behind bars. But he was arrested by monsters for the average Giller when approved with the public. But by 2021, the authority ruled differently. They declared parole to be, quote, the safest pathway for his reintegration into society. They stressed a simple point. Once a sentence is served, the law does not allow indefinite detention. To live on this flying with a fight and described. And he was placed under strict reporting requirements. And every move he made was to be tracked. When the day came, Skaff left prison under heavy police escort. He wore a mask, avoided cameras, and entered a life under some of the strictest parole conditions in state history. Public reaction was fierce. For many, it felt like justice had been undone, that a man who had shown no remorse was being allowed to rejoin society. Victims and their families spoke of feeling re-traumatized. But others pointed out that this was exactly how the rule of law works. Sentences have limits, and parole, however unpopular, provides a way to manage reintegration under supervision, rather than risk an unsupervised release. The decision reignited a national debate. Should some crimes justify keeping offenders locked away forever? Or must society uphold the principle that even the worst offenders, once their punishment is served, cannot be jailed beyond the law? Reflection and legacy. So what do we make of all this? The Sydney gang rapes weren't just crimes against individuals. They were crimes against a community's sense of safety. They forced Australia to confront uncomfortable truths about race, gender, and justice. Some commentators argued that by painting the perpetrators as monsters from outside mainstream society, The public missed the broader issue of misogyny, a violence deeply rooted across cultures. Judge Finane himself admitted years later that he still struggled to understand the attacker's motivations. Was it hatred of women? Hatred of Australians? A toxic mix of both? We may never fully know, but we do know this. Those cases reshaped New South Wales law, scarred a generation of women, and remain etched in the memory of modern Australia. That's all for today's episode. The Sydney gang rapes remind us of the devastating impact of collective violence, the struggles of victims navigating the justice system, and the delicate balance between punishment, rehabilitation, and the rule of law. If you or someone you know has been affected by sexual assault, I urge you to seek support. In Australia, you can contact 1-800-RESPECT, the National Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Hotline, available 24/7. Thank you for listening. I'm Rob Reimer. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and join me again as we continue to explore the crimes that changed our world.